morning, good afternoon, or maybe good evening, depending upon where you are. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and Director of External Relations for the Friends of Ukraine Network, FOUN. For today's discussion, How to Rebuild Ukraine, we have two FOUN members, a couple of their finest, including one of our Nobel laureates. Anders Aslund is a Swedish economist, former senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, chairman of the International Advisory Council at the Center for Social and Economic Research, and chairman of FOUN's Reimagining, Reconstruction, and Recovery of Ukraine Task Force. For those following Ukraine since independence, you know Anders has been a major force in following and reporting on and advising regarding Ukraine's economy, as well as a fabulous source for information on economies such as Russia's. Simon Johnson is Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at MIT Sloan School of Management. Together with Daron Acemoglu, another FOUN member, and James Robinson, Simon was the 2024 Nobel Memorial Prize winner in Economic Sciences for innovative research about what affects countries' economic prosperity in the long run. Their empirical research demonstrates the fundamental importance of the type of political and economic institutions that were introduced during colonialization. They overturn conventional wisdom about how economies work, revealing an untold story of who wins and who loses the rewards of prosperity. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I hope you are. If you have questions, you can use the Q&A section on the monitor. Anders, I will turn it over and bow out.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you very much, Simon, for doing this. And last year, you, Professor Johnson, received the Nobel Prize of Economics together with your MIT colleague, Daron Acemoglu, and the University of Chicago professor, James Robinson. You have written a lot together. And you received, as Bob McConnell just mentioned, this great honor for having contributed innovative research about what affects a country's economic prosperity in the long run. And our obvious question today is how this impacts or should impact Ukraine. And this is all the more relevant because you have intermittently dealt with Ukraine for over 30 years. In particular, you and I assisted the Ukrainian government in the fall of '94 in order to conclude the first IMF stabilization agreement that Ukraine ever had. And that succeeded, and hyperinflation was gone from Ukraine for good. And I want to start this conversation with a few questions of mine. And I would also tell the audience that you are most welcome to put your questions into the Q&A, and I will draw on them later on, or I will incorporate them in my questions. So let me begin, Simon. My overall question to you is, what should the government in Ukraine do to break its conundrum of poor institutions and low economic growth? What is most important in the Ukrainian situation? What has been done that you think is important, and what are the key shortfalls that remain?
Well, thank you, Anders, for that question, and thanks for the opportunity, Bob and everyone, to discuss these important issues with you today. Look, Anders, I think the answer to that question is the same as it was in 1994, actually, which is you need the rule of law. which means you need a court system and you need all the apparatus around that that fairly adjudicates. That's the basis for eradicating corruption. That's the basis for creating an environment within which businesses of all size, big, medium, and the very smallest, people can invest. People, entrepreneurs, business people need confidence that they will be able to get some financial benefits when they take financial risks. And if we look back again over those 30 years, Anders, you and I were also engaged in working in Poland and other places. And I often think about that comparison in that moment. Ukraine seemed to me in 1994 and even earlier to be able to get onto roughly the same path that Poland was struggling to get onto. I think looking back, Poland has done much better than Ukraine because Poland really did establish a viable, working, robust, not perfect, of course, it's never perfect, but a robust rule of law. And that needs to be the priority in Ukraine. I think President Zelensky grasped this, including in his TV show and in his early time in office, but it's very hard during war to maintain ordinary, well-functioning institutions. We struggled with this during World War II in a lot of countries, by the way, including the UK. And the US has had some bad moments with regard to elements of rule of law in various wartime periods. So it's not an easy task, but it is the priority.
Yeah, and that naturally leads over to the next question, and that is what should Ukraine do politically that is different? Because you can say that the big difference between Ukraine and Poland, why they went on different tracks, laying in their different politics. So what should Ukraine do politically now in order to open up for economic progress?
Well, look, there's no easy answers to that question, Anders. I think that every country needs a legitimate government. Every country needs periodic elections. You need a renewal of the democratic mandate. You need feedback. But of course, when you're at war and when you're being attacked, it's incredibly hard to pull that off. Plus, Ukraine has had we can say good fortune, but also additional difficulties created by the fact that so many people have left Ukraine. So the good fortune is that they were able to move to other countries, mostly to Europe. They're being treated well there. Many of them have found jobs, and they, of course, will look and should. I mean, that's what every individual would do: is look at the situation back home and look at wherever they are in Sweden or Germany or Italy, and say, look, this is the situation I have in a now very large diaspora. This is what's available to me if I go home in terms of job, prospects, housing, and so on. So people are going to be weighing these two things, Anders, and in order to bring them back to Ukraine and reinvigorate the economy, it's going to have to be at an individual level compelling, particularly if there are lingering security threats of any kind. So this is a daunting task. My own personal recommendation, Anders, which I understand is not going to be super popular in some quarters, is to bring in judicial officials, judges of various kinds, and perhaps others from sympathetic, well-run European countries. The UK would be one nominee, retired judges, for example. I think Scandinavia, Nordic countries might well be able to provide exactly this kind of personnel. And I think if you brought in these outside eyes, particularly focused on business investment and business sector, I think that would be a very big signal. And I think that would change some realities on the ground. It's not what most countries do or want to do most of the time. I understand that. It's, feels very awkward to bring in foreigners to do this sort of thing. But I think the situation is sufficiently dire, primarily due to the actions in the moment of Russia, Mr. Putin, that something like this, something pretty dramatic in terms of institutional renewal is needed.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very strong point. And I understand that your general answer is democracy and rule of law.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then you are, as Robert mentioned, an MIT Professor of Entrepreneurship. MIT and Stanford are the two anchors of US innovation and technological developments. What conclusions do you draw from your position at MIT about what Ukraine should focus on when it comes to industries and technologies, which are most beneficial for national economic progress in Ukraine? What do you say on this point?
Well, I think we're living fairly obviously in the age of AI, Anders, and I see everything through the lens of And I would stipulate, let's agree that it may well be an excessive boom. There may well be too much investment in some technologies. Some things may prove to be disappointing, but that this is still, I think, the organizing principle for an enormous amount of what business is doing, both in terms of the foundation models, OpenAI, Anthropic, and so on, but also in terms of business applications, and quite frankly, in terms of what the Trump administration is attempting to do right now with its own staff and administration and government officials. So AI runs through everything, and within AI, Anders, there's clearly a software piece, an information technology piece, where Ukraine can play quite effectively, both in terms of perhaps fundamental inventions, but also applications around the world. That's going to be a very big market. There's also going to be a very big market for defeating bad actors in this space. I mean, we can see AI-powered scams, for example. That's actually the cover story of The Economist this week. Despite everything else going on around the world, they focused on these scams, and I think that's appropriate because AI allows impersonation and allows a reach globally that's very dangerous. I think Ukraine is already clearly aligned with the United States and with our best interests. That can be a source of great opportunities. But also on the hardware side, Anders, critical minerals, which is a broad category, and there's a lot of minerals in there. Rare earths is sometimes mentioned, but there's others that matter too. Ukraine has a lot of these minerals, and I think if they can arrange for productive investment, and if the governance of that investment is done properly, and I particularly am a fan of the Alaska Permanent Fund, which receives a royalty for oil extraction in Alaska. It runs that money into an endowment that's run on very transparent, low-cost lines, rather like Norway, actually. But the difference is in Alaska, they pay out a cash dividend to everybody who lives in Alaska at the beginning of the year based on the returns from this endowment. So let's imagine that there are development of these critical minerals, Anders. Secure supply chains around the world are going to be very important for the AI industry, including for the United States. And we have some critical minerals, but actually not that much in the US. So we need this kind of partnership. You make the investment, you receive those dividends, the royalties, and you share that with people who live in Ukraine. That's a significant potential inducement to move back to Ukraine. It puts cash in the pockets of people living in Ukraine. You share the wealth from minerals. So this is not an exploitative system that you hopefully not exploitative. It's more of a participatory system. I think that could be in conjunction with other measures, including, of course, much more resolving the security problem and developing the human capital you need for a strong IT sector. I think this could play a positive role.
Yeah, well, Ukraine has a very strong IT sector today, and but we have other sectors also. Agriculture accounts for 2/3 of exports as it is today. Before the war, it used to be about 40%. Before the war, steel and iron ore accounted for 40% of exports. Now it's a very small share because of what has been lost in the war. Arms used to be 10% of Ukraine's exports, unfortunately mainly going to Russia before 2014. And it was mainly parts of arms rather than complete arms. How do you look upon these three big traditional sectors? And we're now seeing that the armament sector is really coming strongly back. Agriculture, steel, and arms.
So obviously agriculture is going to remain a very important sector for Ukraine and for the world. So Ukraine provides, as you know, a lot of food and a lot of vegetable oil that the world needs. And I think that sector will continue to be strong, and investing in that sector, helping them with technology and so on. I think that's relatively straightforward, subject, of course, to it being safe to farm in various areas. On the production of metals, my understanding is if we're talking about the processing of metals, some significant part of those facilities are now under Russian control. So the answer to that question would require knowing where the borders are drawn in any kind of temporary or permanent peace agreement. But the raw material, I believe, the critical minerals, is much more in central Ukraine, currently under Ukrainian control, Anders. So I think that is my suggestion to be developed further, no doubt, that the critical minerals can feed into production elsewhere. The problem, of course, is if you become purely a mineral extraction place, you can have a lot of inequality, you can have a lot of corruption, and so on and so forth. So guarding against that with something like the Alaska Permanent Fund structure, particularly where there's a dividend that comes directly to Ukrainian citizens. The Alaska Permanent Fund, by the way, originally was proposed by libertarians in Alaska, then adopted by the Republican Party more broadly, and the Democrats are fully on board with it too. So I think politically that works in a variety of different environments. I think it would work in Ukraine. On arms, look, I think it's no secret to anyone that Ukraine is at the forefront of the development of drones and anti-missile defenses. And I think we'll come on to talk about security, I think, in a few moments on this, but something like, we do have examples of relatively small countries that have maintained some distance, but also had productive partnerships with the US. I'm thinking of Finland, I'm thinking of Israel, I'm thinking of Ireland. Now, Finland and Israel obviously had big security needs that they addressed themselves, and both have been really quite innovative in terms of how weapons are developed and used in their spaces. And I think the Finnish model in particular, Anders, perhaps the Swedish model also, but I'm not going to tell you about that one. You can tell me. I think that these are sensible. And I think, unless you think Ukraine is going to be absorbed quickly into NATO, which I have not seen any serious discussion of, then I think defending themselves and having a strong ability to really build the equipment you need for that defense is important. And what is the most important form of defense we see currently? Well, partly it's what the Russians call information warfare in the information space. So that's a lot of IT we've been talking about. But it's also obviously drones and missiles. And it's the ability of any enemy to strike your military, civilian infrastructure facilities and blow it. If you rebuild it and they blow it up, that's a problem. So that is something that technology where I expect Ukraine to really lead the world.
Yeah, no, I think that this is something big. I saw the former Minister of Strategic Industries recently in Davos, Alexander Kamishin, and he said that we can now produce arms, mainly drones, for $30 billion this year. But unfortunately, we only have financing for $10 billion. So then either Europe should put up the money so that Ukraine can get the arms, or Ukraine can export some of their excellent drones right now. And among your many former titles, you have also been chief economist of the IMF, and you already touched upon NATO. But does Ukraine need to become a member of NATO so that foreign investors will feel safe? And what kind of international framework do you see? Everybody talks about EU accession, not least the EU itself. But what other jobs should key international financial institutions do in Ukraine? What kind of framework, international framework, do you see? And should a Marshall Plan agency be established? And if so, how? What should the outside world do in terms of organization for Ukraine's reconstruction?
Well, I'll start with the EU accession. I think that's relatively straightforward, Anders. Yes, of course, that's a good idea. That has helped. It creates a potential for the right path. It is a slow process, as you know, and I don't think you should count on a magic immediately occurring. But I think it sets expectations, and if you don't do it at this point, that would be a concern. And within that, emphasizing the rule of law, as I said, and working with countries who have strong rule of law, and even bringing in personnel, I think would be really quite important, and the EU accession process will help legitimize that. On NATO, look, if that becomes part of the peace agreement or settlement or truce or whatever Mr. Trump is able to negotiate, I would be greatly encouraged, because yes, if Ukraine were in NATO, if there's an agreement on all sides that this is where NATO now ends, then I think that would be incredibly helpful across all the dimensions we're talking about, Anders. I don't know if that's going to happen, and if it doesn't happen, I think Ukraine will need to proceed with more like the Finnish model. Obviously, Finland was independent and neutral and not NATO affiliated for ever since World War II. Sweden, I believe, Anders, was essentially neutral for 200 years and able to maintain that neutrality in a difficult neighborhood. So there are some models out there, and it's not NATO or nothing. Clearly, Ukraine will be aligned more with Western Europe, more with the United States. That's the values of the people. That's the kind of opportunities that we're discussing, that's where they'll get a fair deal as well. On the Marshall Plan idea, look, I think realistically, expectations for money from the US Congress are not high right now. I think the Europeans hopefully will step up and fill some of those gaps. I do think the development of critical minerals is a real possibility at scale. And perhaps instead of a Marshall Plan, which rather implies perhaps a little bit more intrusive foreign control, I like the Alaska Permanent Fund model, Anders, where you're earning money and receiving funds from the development of a key resource in your country, and then you're managing the distribution of those resources to citizens. And I like lump sum payments, Anders. Honestly, it's very transparent, it's very clear. It's not involving a lot of bureaucrats. You can do it extremely efficiently. You're putting money in the pockets of people who've suffered enormous damage. And I think it's fair. And you're enticing people back to Ukraine. No one is going to be forced back to Ukraine, I'm sure. West European countries have a very good attitude on all of this. But you want people to want to move back. But why would they move back? What's for them in Ukraine? That's a question that really has to be addressed. And I think cash in the pockets, if you move back to Ukraine, will be helpful.
Yeah, elaborating a bit on these resource industries. Of course, big Western companies like Shell, Exxon, and Chevron have been involved in Ukraine, but they have never succeeded to really do something. So the energy and mineral sectors in Ukraine have been completely oligarchic. And I think that now, whatever happens, big money is likely to be involved. And then it's much easier to change the framework, as you suggest, because the governance for getting any kind of energy license has been completely impossible. Now this will change. And also the big Western energy companies and mining companies, they are tough. They know how to handle a tough environment. So it's probably the right kind of big enterprises that can lead development in Ukraine. But we were already touching upon what should be done after the war. And there is one specific discussion that particularly Keynes developed, what should be done immediately after the war. Ukraine now has the surprisingly good financial balance, even if inflation has now gone up to 11%. The budget deficit for the last 2 years has been fully financed by international funding, and that is likely to be the case also for this year. But when the war ends, what should Ukraine particularly think of? I'm not now more thinking of your old IMF hat and not your Professor of Entrepreneurship hat. What do you say, Samuel?
I'm going with the entrepreneurship hat, actually, Anders. I mean, I think I agree. I think the macro balance is okay, it's under control. And obviously, that statement depends on how much external financial assistance is provided. But I think if the war could stop immediately in the near future, I think we'd be okay on that front. I do think getting young people to come back to Ukraine, Anders, is key. That's where your dynamism comes from. That's where your economy comes from. That's where your tax base comes from. So what is it that will bring those young people back? Is it the housing? Is it the economic opportunity? Is it access to sort of lump sum payments that I was talking about? I don't have the answer to that, but I think focusing on bringing talented people back, preferably obviously with their families, that's going to be essential. You know, if it's a real rebuilding moment and opportunity, and I think you can get a lot of dynamism and energy. So this is a supply side story, right? And that will help you on all the public finance angles. If you can't get the young people to come back, if they hesitate, if they hold back, say, well, I don't know, is it really over? Let me wait and see for a year or two. Everything on the macro side is going to be much harder.
Yeah, but when moving over to the entrepreneurship side, I was at the board of the Ukrainian state railroads for 2.5 years. And something that was very interesting was to interview people for top management jobs. And what struck me was that there were only 3 of the big enterprise groups in Ukraine that have actual managers. In the others, it was an owner, a so-called oligarch, who decided everything, and then he just had assistants. And these assistants were not really managers because they were not used to make the decisions. But Sloan School is one of the top management institutes in the world. What particularly do you see should be done about management in Ukraine? Engineers Ukraine has, but managers, it has very few of.
I think it's all about experience, Anders. I know I teach in a school, I know we have classes, but I've been very a big proponent of experiential learning, or action learning as it's called, over the past 3 decades. I think look for people who've had experience, young people who've done things, particularly in different environments, in well-functioning rule of law, good, strong rule of law environments, and bring them on quickly, Anders, promote them up the ladder, and you'll be quite astonished by what they can accomplish. I think there's plenty of management techniques and tools and schools that could be mobilized, but right now, Ukraine's potential big advantage is there's a lot of people scattered around the world who are building that talent and that expertise. If you can get them to come back to Ukraine and apply themselves and stick with it, I think you can have a very vibrant economy. But if they don't want to come back, if they don't see the opportunity, if they say, no, it's too corrupt, or I'm just not interested because it's too dangerous for my family, then we have a much longer lasting problem.
Yeah, I see here in the chat that there is a question from an anonymous attendee. How do you see the Ukrainian higher education sector fitting into the rebuilding of Ukraine? What is the shape of it now, and what can and should be done?
Well, again, it's the age of AI, Anders, and I think the idea of renewing and upgrading everybody's higher education, this is not specific to Ukraine, but using AI tools and figuring out ways to give more people access, to make sure they have state-of-the-art knowledge, to integrate them with global thinking. This is a very powerful and vibrant space. Now, AI in education is not the top priority of US tech companies, mostly because they have other big items on their agendas. This is a great opportunity for Ukraine, I would say, to lead the way on this and to show how you can use AI-powered education, not just to higher education, but across all of education. But that, I think, would be my answer on the higher education piece.
Yeah, no, I think that this is something very important. I was chairman for 9 years of the Kiev School of Economics, and it was then a small institution. It has developed very well, but it's important that Ukraine has these domestic institutions that are of good quality. But I saw last year there were 52,000 Ukrainian students at Polish universities. So Poland is today the biggest source of good education for Ukrainians. Let me move on to the financing that I've already touched upon. And the World Bank is just about to publish this month its third assessment of the damage Russia's war has caused Ukraine. We know that it will be slightly more than $500 billion, which is an enormous amount of money. That is 2.5 times Ukraine's current GDP. And the obvious question, I know you and Oleg Ustenko has written about it, should Russia pay war reparations, and how should that be possible?
Yes, my long-standing view on this, Anders, is that the so-called frozen assets in Russia, of Russia in the West, should be used for rebuilding purposes. And you could, for example, structure this as long-term loan. So you could rebuild a particular bridge and put a sign on it saying, paid for with Russian money, with the clear statement that if it's destroyed, that money is lost. If the bridge stays in place and Ukraine is prosperous for 20 or 50 years, perhaps there'll be some return of that capital. So I think that is the frozen asset piece. But I'm also intrigued, Anders, and I think many people are starting to pay attention to an idea that's circulating in Washington. It's not yet a formal proposal, and I don't know where it stands relative to the White House. But there's an idea of something called, some people are calling a Russian universal tariff, which will be imposed by the US on oil shipped from Russia by tanker. It could be $5 or $10 or $50. Now, most of that Russian oil, as you know, does not go to the United States. It goes to places like India and China. And the ability of the US to impose a tariff unilaterally on trade between third parties has never been fully tested or even proposed. But what's interesting about this is if you control and sanction the shadow fleet, which of course the Biden administration finally managed to think about in its last few days, way too late in my opinion. But if the shadow fleet is sanctioned, and we know that Chinese ports don't want to take sanctioned tankers, then all the oil and gas, but it's mostly about oil, shipped by tanker goes through Western-owned tankers, and Western financial services are involved. So the Russian universal tariff could say, everybody who lifts oil, oh, and all of this, by the way, is known in real time, in case anyone wasn't aware of that now. All of these tankers are tracked. They all pass through the Baltic Sea, or almost all pass through the Baltic Sea or through the Black Sea. So at least you know exactly who's carrying and what they're carrying, because you can see how laden the ships are relative to the water level. The owners of those ships, or the operators, depending on how you want to do it, could be responsible for paying $10 or $20 or $40 into a fund administered by the United States. And that fund could be used to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine in some fashion, or finance this Alaska Permanent Fund that I'm talking about. Now, we usually think that when you put that kind of tax on anybody's exports, it will discourage exports. But the fact of the matter is that marginal cost of production in Western Siberia is, if you include all the costs of reinvestment, no more than $45 a barrel. And so if the world price is between 70 and 85, there's a big margin of profit there. And actually the marginal cost on a current basis, so not including the reinvestments, is probably closer to $15 or $20 a barrel. And during COVID, Russia shipped as much oil as it could when the world price was between $50 and $20 a barrel. So now this extraterritorial reach of the US government would, of course, violate all existing norms, and the European countries would not be happy about it, for example. But it's not excessive compared to other proposals that Mr. Trump is putting forward and that are, I think, going to gain traction. So if this is done in a fair and transparent manner, the Russians have a choice. Either, and this tax would fall on the Russians in this instance, because nobody's going to be paying the Russians world price and paying the $10 or $40 tariff. So the Russians would get the world price minus that tariff. So it reduces the revenue that can be used to build up the Russian military again. It puts money into the rebuilding effort for Ukraine. It will be run through the US. And it could also be used by Ukraine to buy goods and services, including weapons, from the US. So I think there's a number of attractive elements here. We'll see what Mr. Trump actually negotiates, what he proposes. But this is a tool that if he even starts to talk about it in public, I think could get a great deal of positive attention.
But Simon, we have all these frozen Russian sovereign assets, the $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves that the G7 froze or immobilized, as the term goes, in late February 2022, immediately after Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine had started. Philip Zelikow, who's also a member of our group, has an excellent paper out where he argues that about $50 billion could be taken by the US and another $50 billion by the UK, that the US has much more jurisdiction over these funds than is commonly understood. And in April last year, the US Congress adopted the Repo Act, which was essentially adopted to seize these assets. The Biden administration never did it. And I don't hear the Trump administration so far talking about it. Do you think that this money should be seized by the US and the UK? And also, most of the money is in Belgium, in the Euroclear bank system, which is $200 billion or so, but the UK and the US probably has a jurisdiction over some of it, according to Philip Zelikow's argument. What's your take here?
Yes, Anders, I've also been working on this issue since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, including early on with Phil, and I totally agree that these assets should be applied towards repairing the damage in Ukraine. The Europeans have long been a big difficulty. I agree the Biden administration didn't push hard on this. The Europeans have really dragged their feet, and I think the Belgians want to be indemnified against being sued by the Russians subsequently, and so on and so forth. I think you need to cut through this tangle. Perhaps Mr. Trump is the right person to do that. That would be terrific. I do like the idea that you take the Russian money and use that to rebuild specific infrastructure that was destroyed by Russia, and you put a big sign on it saying, paid for by Russia, and we'll pay you back if you don't destroy this again in perhaps it's 100 years, right? But I think that the idea that Russian money is at risk if Russia attacks Ukraine again after a peace, that to me seems like an appealing angle. But yes, I think that if you drive your car into a crowd of people and you kill people, you owe compensation. I think it's pure and simple compensation for the damage caused by deliberate, willful, dangerous actions, including dropping bombs on people in this case. And I think Russia, unusually among aggressor countries, has had a big current account surplus and has had these assets parked in Western countries. And I think the rules and norms of the world economy need to change. If you attack peaceful neighbors in this kind of manner and you do damage, you owe them compensation. And if you've got assets parked in Western capitals, those assets will be taken to compensate the victims. That's a totally reasonable. That's a principle that we apply in all our economies domestically, but we've not done that internationally. I think that needs to change.
Well, it was done on Iraq. Iraq was forced to pay $52 billion in damages, mainly to Kuwait because of its attack and occupation of Kuwait in 1990. And it paid up everything at the beginning of 2022. So that is settled, and that I think it's a very powerful precedent.
Right, and Iraq, as I understand it, did a lot of that through supervised oil sales. So it was the ongoing revenue from selling oil. Part of that went into the fund that paid compensation. So that's exactly aligned with the Russian universal tariff proposal, which is that in addition to frozen assets, you would take a tax or tariff on all Russian energy exports. Well, you can't tax the pipeline ones as easily going to China, but you can tax what goes through on tankers, because Western countries control the global tanker fleet, except for the shadow piece, but the shadow piece can be properly sanctioned. So I think, yes, the Iraq analogy is a very good one, Anders, and should be.
Yeah, you have touched several times on the sanction regime on Russia. And what is your overall assessment of what has been done so far? The question that is always posed is, are the Western sanctions on Russia effective or not? And you normally get a very definitive answer in black or white. What's your take on it?
Well, the partial sanctions that were imposed have obviously not been effective because the war has continued, and so have the killings. But I think to be clear, Anders, and this is very important, the sanctions were deliberately not imposed on what really matters to Russia, which is the sale of oil, particularly oil via tanker. So that was deliberately exempted because there was concern about reducing the supply of Russian oil to the world market. That was the idea. There was then an attempt to address it through the oil price cap, which was a good idea in principle, but the cap wasn't low enough and the enforcement wasn't done comprehensively, and the shadow fleet was allowed to develop, and Western companies were allowed to sell their ships into the shadows. So all of this should be stopped. I mean, we know where these transactions are, we know where these companies are. A lot of them operate out of Dubai. Dubai exists under the American security umbrella. I think Mr. Trump is right in when he says that too many countries have taken advantage of the US over many years, particularly with regard to security umbrella, and they're not doing things that we Americans want and that are in our national interests, such as stopping the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think this is the technicalities are trivial. The exerting extra legal reach of the US state is something Mr. Trump is doing anyway. The question is, does he want to apply this in a way that will be, I think, quite fair. It would immediately get the attention of the Kremlin because they need this oil revenue in order to stay in business. And then the question is, at what level does he set the tariff? So a typical Mr. Trump kind of approach would be to say, look, it's a $5 tariff on Russian oil this week. We'll show you that it bites. Next week it's 10. Week after it's 20. Week after that it's 40. And then we'll see what brings the Russians to the table. If they don't have oil revenue, Anders, and you've frozen their assets substantially, they can't buy the electronic components from China that they need to put in their missiles and or drones, and the drones they buy from Iran are also, they can't buy that. I don't think China is going to lend Russia a lot of money for these activities. It's cash. It's a cash business. But if Russia doesn't have the cash, they're going to have real trouble continuing the war at this level.
Yeah, there's an article in Financial Times today about a leaked report from the Russian government about how they are suffering, not only directly from the sanctions, but also from their allies that are utilizing the sanctions in order to get cheaper products from Russia. And I saw now that among the Russian, the cars being sold in Russia last year, apart from Lada, which comes at number one, the 9 next brands are all Chinese. So the Chinese are taking over much of the Russian market and are slaughtering the much weaker Russian manufacturers, who on top of everything don't have a relevant Western technology. I have here in the chat a question from Michael Balhutrak, who, and this is a question that touches many. How can small non-profits and private individuals help build, rebuild and construct? And how can one make sure that fund allocated from rebuilding from Western countries goes directly to individuals rather than to oligarchs?
Well, a distribution of funds through the government direct to individuals is absolutely possible, and they have a pretty transparent IT system to do that. Non-profits can obviously not access that, outside non-profits not access that directly, but that's not hard. And I do think cash transfers to people are actually a very good thing to do in this situation, because they need cash, and cash lets them make their own decisions, and you're cutting out a lot of administrative layers when you do that. Look, I think that the biggest way to help rebuild is to help bring transparency, help people, establish and document that they can live and they can invest without there being corruption. And to the extent there are shakedowns or side payments or whatever, you make those absolutely plain and clear. And I think that's you're doing everyone a service when you do that.
There is a big discussion mainly with the European Union. The European Union wants to give the money directly to the regions. The Ukrainian government, the presidential office, wants everything or most things to go through the central Ukrainian government. What's your view of this conflict between regions and cities versus the central government? What is the right approach here? What can be done?
Well, obviously, central government needs to do some things, including on the defense side. I don't think the regions are proposing that. But on terms of economic reconstruction and rebuilding and determining priorities, I would rather favor the decentralized approach, actually, Anders. Now, you've got to think about the corruption at the local level too, of course. But subject to that, I think having local people, local elected leaders respond to local pressures, that's really very helpful in terms of accountability. And to the extent that certain areas find what better ways forward more quickly, you're then creating a race to the top, let's say, which is healthy. So I think put more money in the hands of regions and money in the hands of people. Just let people do their own rebuilding and organize that to the extent that it's possible.
Thank you. I should tell the audience that you are most welcome to put more questions or comments into the Q&A. I'm happy to introduce more of it. But let me then give you a more general question, Simon. That could be the last question. where does Ukraine's future lie? How do you have already said much about it, but how would you like to summarize your view of Ukraine's future? Normatively, positively.
Yeah, look, I'm optimistic about Ukraine, Anders, but I've been optimistic for 30 years. So let's be clear about that. Terrific people, fantastic human capital, very pro-Western, pro-market attitudes, a really deep understanding of the benefits of democracy. I mean, they've had a very tough run in terms of leadership and the policies that have been pursued. And now they have experienced, many of them, the advantages of living outside of Ukraine. So they will see if individual, talented, very smart Ukrainians want to go back, when they want to go back, on what terms that they want to go back. That's the key for all countries, I think, Anders. And that's, I think, not a problem. It is. You could say that's a problem that Ireland faced for a long time. Ireland has a very big diaspora, of course, from the 19th century, and rebuilding Ireland and making Ireland a compelling place for inward investment took a long time, but they pulled it off. It's quite impressive. Israel, of course, the migration dynamic was quite different. A lot of people wanted to move to Israel. Finland, I think, is again an interesting role model. I don't think obviously there was outmigration in the 19th century, as there was from other parts of Scandinavia. But I think in this post-war period, when they were really confronting a very dangerous neighbor with whom they still have unsettled issues, I think Finland found a way to make themselves vibrant, to encourage young people to stay, to build very strong democracy, and welcoming them into NATO was a very natural step. I actually think, Anders, and I said this to quite a few people when I was in Stockholm recently, and I think they tended to agree, that when we write the history of this epoch, the fact that Sweden and Finland are no longer neutral will stand out to future historians as a big marker of how attitudes have changed. And so then the question is, how does Ukraine survive if it doesn't come into NATO as part of whatever settlement now emerges? And I think the answer is to be resilient and strong and well defended, and to plug yourself into the global economy in ways that really matter to powerful people who, let's face it, in the age of AI, are disproportionately concentrated in the United States.
Yeah. No, with regard to neutrality, face it, Ukraine was neutral before until Russia attacked, and that is the reason why it was attacked. So Sweden and Finland instantly drove a conclusion in February 2022. Neutrality is no longer plausible or credible, and we are also seeing that there are pressures in Austria that is this really a credible future today? But when I ask for more questions here, I have the question that I really expected. It's from Alison Mayer. USAID typically plays a large role in enforcing accountability and in promoting anti-corruption. But now the USAID has been shuttered. What international organizations do you believe will step in to fill these gaps in funding and oversight, if any?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I think an extremely timely one. So obviously we look to the World Bank, we look to the IMF, and I think both organizations are well aware that they're going to need to step up on exactly this front. I think the non-profits, this is referring back to the question a few moments ago, finding ways to monitor, to bring accountability, to shine a light on all of these issues. There are people in the non-profit sector who've been doing this for a long time. But I think this is something that's going to be increasingly top priority. I think USAID played a very positive role in many aspects of what they were doing in Ukraine, including support for the energy sector, for example. And this is now a critical need. And I think the US national interest needs to take this into account and understand that sometimes you do help the US, its position in the world and its safety in the world by helping other people directly. I mean, helping people through investment and trade, absolutely, I'm in favor of that. Generating jobs in the United States, totally in favor of that. But I think USAID played a very positive role in some key moments in Ukraine recently, and we need to find ways to fill those gaps, Anders.
Yeah. No, I would add there that I think that the critical institution is likely to be the European Union for the reasons you mentioned before. All of these anti-corruption and rule of law conditions are in the acquis communautaire. And the European Union is taking Ukraine now very seriously. The European Commission is more pro-Ukrainian than ever. And I would particularly emphasize Ursula von der Leyen. She emphasizes that her grandfather was the owner of Exxon manufacture in Narva, the biggest factory in Estonia before World War I. And she's strongly committed. And the three Baltic commissioners who are now in the key positions, Kaja Kallas as the High Representative for Foreign Policy. So the European Union and the European Commission are likely to take the lead. And as you have already pointed out, the Nordic 5 and the Baltic 3 and Poland, they are now, I would argue, the strongest supporters of Ukraine, because they see that this is a matter of our security. It's not only Ukraine's security. If the Russians overrun Ukraine, they will come to us, and they are not welcome here. So these countries are now arming as fast as they just can and developing their armaments industry. I think that I have exhausted my questions, and I think that you have provided a very good answer. So I should ask Robert McConnell if he wants to come in and conclude.
Thank you, Anders. Thank you, Simon. I thought this was fascinating, very interesting, a lot of things to think about, as well as to work toward, I believe. I thank you both. Thank you for being on this webinar. I thank you for your roles in the Friends of Ukraine network. I thank our audience. We've had a pretty good audience here today. And I hope everybody has a good rest of the day. I will comment that I'm the only one not wearing yellow and blue, although I do have my lapel pin. You came dressed for the occasion. So everyone, Anders in Florida, Simon, I'm here waiting for the snow in Washington. Have a good day, and we'll be in touch. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, the audience.